Something to do with them learning something about losing the last House election? But I really don't know.
We don't know, and I don't know that they'll ever tell us in a way that we feel like we can trust. But I think it's probably worth something here that the Speaker of the House, the Republican Speaker of the House, is no longer Paul Ryan. It's Kevin McCarthy, and Paul Ryan and Kevin McCarthy have been on the same team and working so closely together for so long that we don't know of any divisions that we can see between them from a distance. But we may be learning something about Kevin McCarthy being a different guy than Paul Ryan in terms of what he's willing to endure in terms of embarrassment from his own caucus. This may be Kevin McCarthy deciding to do the right thing for the right reasons. I'm just not sure we'll know that anytime soon.
I don't know. Let me think.
Could be. Come on.
No, Rachel, I want that to be true. I want that to be true. I'm going to sleep on it. I'm going to hope it's true.
I'm a little silver lining. I follow you around. I know you're a dark cloud. I follow you around. I catch you every once in a while.
It was beautifully put. I want to believe. I want to believe.
Thank you, Len.
Thank you, Rachel. We have breaking news tonight indicating that while many reporters and pundits recently have been speculating that the Mueller investigation is close to an end, there is much more to the investigation than any of us can know, including this new report in the Daily Beast tonight with the lead, quote, "The special counsel's office and federal prosecutors in Manhattan are scrutinizing a meeting involving former House Intelligence Committee Chairman Devin Nunes, one-time National Security Advisor Michael Flynn, and dozens of foreign officials, according to 3 sources familiar with the investigations. The investigation is about a breakfast event at the Trump Hotel in Washington 2 days before the Trump inauguration. The event came to the attention of prosecutors who were investigating possible misuse of funds by the Trump inaugural committee. Michael Flynn, of course, has already pleaded guilty to lying to the FBI and has been cooperating with investigators. This is the first time that Devin Nunes' name has surfaced in any reports concerning the special prosecutor's investigation. And so Robert Mueller's investigation continues, and none of us really know exactly what he is investigating, who he is investigating, or how many different things and cases and episodes he is investigating, how many potential defendants still face some jeopardy as Robert Mueller continues his work. Is Devin Nunes now contemplating seeking immunity from the special prosecutor in exchange for telling everything he knows about possible Russian influence in the Trump campaign or the Trump transition or the Trump White House, or Russian influence over Donald Trump himself? Today, NBC's Kristen Welker asked the President of the United States the question that produced the answer that will follow Donald Trump for the rest of his life and beyond. It may turn out to be the most memorable line of the Trump presidency. It surely would be for any other presidency, but Donald Trump is so verbally explosive, we have no idea what's coming tomorrow. To put what the president said today in historical perspective, let's consider just for a moment how little most of us can remember of what presidents actually say. And I don't mean phrases like hope and change or shining city on a hill or 1,000 points of light. I mean full sentences. And the truth of it is that most of us usually cannot remember a single full sentence spoken by a president. I mean, Jimmy Carter, I can't remember a single full sentence he said. And that's not unusual. That's true for most presidents. So just an example, I will now recite for you every full sentence that I can remember a president saying since the dawn of mass media in the radio age, when the President of the United States first became a recognizable voice nationally through the magic of radio about 90 years ago. The only thing we have to fear is fear itself. Ask not what your country can do for you, ask what you can do for your country. I shall not seek and will not accept the nomination of my party for another term as your president. Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall. I did not have sexual relations with that woman, Ms. Lewinsky. That's all I can remember, word for word, in full sentences from the last 90 years of the American presidency. It's not about the eloquence of the president. We've had no more eloquent president than Barack Obama, but his sentences were not sound bites. and perhaps more importantly, Barack Obama was never at the center of a scandal or a collapsing presidency. And that's what produces some of our most memorable presidential lines, like President Lyndon Johnson announcing in 1968, as his presidency was drowning in anti-war protest, that he would not run for re-election. Johnson's party was deserting him then for two anti-war candidates, Gene McCarthy and Bobby Kennedy. And so at the lowest point of his presidency, LBJ shocked us with that sentence that we did not expect and could never forget, that he was not going to run for re-election. Bill Clinton's most memorable quote comes from his reaction to part of the scandal that led to his impeachment in the House of Representatives. And the one line that I left out of that collection is the presidential line that was echoed today by Donald Trump. And it is the most memorable line of Richard Nixon's 5.5 years as President of the United States. And it comes from the heart of the scandal that led the House Judiciary Committee voting to bring articles of impeachment against President Nixon, and not long after that, President Nixon's resignation.
I'm not a crook.
I'm not a crook. Today's easy-to-remember presidential line came in response to an investigation which could lead to something we've seen before: the resignation of a president or the impeachment of a president. And it could possibly lead to something we've never seen before: the impeachment of a president in the House of Representatives and the conviction and removal of that president from office by the United States Senate.
I never worked for Russia.
In history, that line will have a longer life than Mexico will pay for the wall. Today, January 14th, 2019, will hold its spot in history as the first and only day on which a president of the United States has denied being an agent for a foreign government. That is what it's come to. This is the "I am not a crook" moment in the Trump presidency. That Nixon quote is important not just because it's so easily memorable, but because Richard Nixon was denying what became the essential accusation against him by a special prosecutor and the members of the House Judiciary Committee who voted to impeach him. And it turns out Richard Nixon was a crook. And that was the single most important thing you could know about Richard Nixon. And that is the space he occupies in history: our criminal president. When Richard Nixon said he was not a crook, we out there in the audience couldn't prove that he was. And so tonight, after hearing the President of the United States deny that he is now or ever has been a Russian agent, we don't know if it's true. We don't know what's true. But we do know that the history of presidents deep in scandal, denying the most damning accusation about them, is a history of presidents not telling the truth. Bill Clinton actually did do what he denied doing in his most famous quote. Richard Nixon actually was a crook. And so now we await Robert Mueller's answer to the question Kristen Welker asked today: have you ever worked for Russia, yes or no? That question came after a weekend of intense media coverage in reaction to a Friday night New York Times report that the FBI opened a counterintelligence investigation of the President of the United States because in the first months of the Trump presidency, after the firing of FBI Director James Comey, the FBI had then the very same question that Kristen Welker asked today: is the president a Russian agent? Shortly after the FBI opened that investigation, Robert Mueller was appointed special counsel to investigate, quote, any links and or coordination between the Russian government and individuals associated with the campaign of President Donald Trump, and any matters that arose or may arise directly from the investigation. And so tonight, Robert Mueller is working on the answer to that question: is the president a Russian agent? When Robert Mueller writes his report on his investigation, President Trump is hoping that Mueller will be handing that report to William Barr, who the president has nominated to be his next attorney general. William Barr's confirmation hearing begins tomorrow morning at 9:30. And in his prepared testimony released in writing today, William Barr says, I believe it is vitally important that the special counsel be allowed to complete his investigation. I have known Bob Mueller personally and professionally for 30 years. We worked closely together throughout my previous tenure at the Department of Justice under President Bush. We've been friends since. I have the utmost respect for Bob and his distinguished record of public service. When he was named special counsel, I said that his selection was good news and that knowing him, I had confidence he would handle the matter properly. I still have that confidence today. The country needs a credible resolution of these issues. If confirmed, I will not permit partisan politics, personal interests, or any other improper consideration to interfere with this or any other investigation. I will follow the special counsel regulations scrupulously and in good faith, and on my watch, Bob will be allowed to complete his work. Leading off our discussion now, Michael Isikoff, chief investigative correspondent for Yahoo News and the co-author of Russian Roulette. Ned Price is with us. He's a former CIA analyst and a former senior director and spokesperson for the National Security Council in the Obama administration. He's an MSNBC national security contributor. And Andrew Weiss, a Russia expert who has served on the staff of the National Security Council and also in the State Department during the Clinton administration. Michael Isikoff, I want to start with you. Having written the book Russian Roulette, you've been trying to get at these questions for literally for years now. You've come closer than most of us have to our answers here. I want to get your reaction to this reporting about the FBI's investigation of the president beginning sooner than we thought and, in effect, sliding into and becoming part of the Mueller investigation.
You know, my reaction is it is time for Congress to step up to the plate and fulfill its constitutional responsibility and try to get answers. Look, we can spend weeks and months waiting for Bob Mueller to complete his investigation. I do think it's closer than you indicated in your opening, but I grant it, we don't know for sure. What I'm less sure about is that when Mueller does complete his investigation, we're going to instantly know the results in any meaningful form. We don't know what kind of report he's writing. It could be an expansive one. It could be a very limited one saying, I've charged these people. I haven't charged these other prospective defendants. We don't know how much of it will be publicly released. There could be a battle over executive privilege. There could be a battle. There's nothing in the regulations that requires public dissemination of this report. So the only people who can get answers to all the questions raised in that New York Times story and all the other stories we've been talking about for 2 years now is the Congress of the United States with public hearings with key fact witnesses, and stop waiting for, some Mueller report that may or may not come anytime soon. We have an opportunity, February 7th, the first opportunity. Elliot Cummings is going to be questioning before the House Oversight Committee Michael Cohen. All questions should be on the table, regardless of whether they get directly into his Mueller testimony. In fact, they should focus on his Mueller testimony, the Trump Tower meeting, the Ukrainian press plan, peace plan, everything else we've been talking about. It's the only way for us to finally get answers to all these questions, and it's really up to Congress now to step up and do its job.
And Ned, what Michael's describing is the way it worked during Watergate. The special prosecutor was working, the congressional investigative committees were working in the Senate, in the House. Even the impeachment hearings were going on in the House Judiciary Committee while the special prosecutor was still working.
That's absolutely right. Unfortunately, in this case, Lawrence, we have a very different model. We have endured a very different model, largely because of the individual you referenced at the top of your intro, and that's Devin Nunes. Devin Nunes ensured that at the outset of this administration, Congress, especially the House, would not be able to undertake a credible investigation because he turned it precisely into partisan warfare. Devin Nunes started as a member of the Trump transition team, and he never really relinquished that role during his time as chairman of the Intelligence Committee. So, unfortunately, we haven't been able to benefit from that model in this presidency. Yes, we have the Senate Intelligence Committee. There has been a much greater degree of comedy between the chair and the ranking member of that committee. But one committee alone that itself is not a special committee around this one issue. It has a whole host of other oversight issues pertaining to the much broader panoply of intelligence activities and institutions, cannot get to the bottom of this alone. So for that reason, we've had to put a lot of stock in Bob Mueller. I agree with Michael. We don't know precisely what he will present us with, but I have no doubt that he will present Congress with, at the very least, an opening to continue the important work that is now moving forward in earnest, that we have a Democratic House and a House, importantly, with the power of the gavel and the power of the subpoena.
Later in this hour, we're going to hear from Eliot Engel, the new chairman of the House Foreign Affairs Committee, and he's announced that he wants to use his subpoena power and his investigative power in that committee to find out exactly what Donald Trump and Vladimir Putin have been talking about, and he's trying to find different ways to find that out. But Andrew Weiss, that strikes me as an investigative mode that, although it seems like relatively normal oversight for that Foreign Affairs Committee to do, it also feeds the investigative process of what's going on here. And you've pointed out that there's a tremendous overlap of questions here in what Robert Mueller's investigating and what's emerged in this Washington Post reporting about the president trying to hide what he says to Vladimir Putin, what Vladimir Putin says to him.
Yeah, right now I think it's important for everyone to sort of focus on a key week of events, and that was during the period for Donald Trump's first face-to-face meeting with Vladimir Putin in Hamburg, Germany in summer of 2017. And what's remarkable about the chronology that is worth focusing on here is how this very first in-person encounter between the two leaders coincided with the scramble inside the White House and inside Trump's own family to respond to a breaking report in the New York Times that sort of was the first confirmed report of a high-level meeting between members of the Trump campaign and a Russian emissary. And what was remarkable is that after the first official bilateral meeting in the G20, Donald Trump went out of his way to seek out Vladimir Putin for an impromptu private session on the margins of a dinner event at the G20 summit. And we don't know what they talked about, but when Trump basically helped draft the statement for Don Jr., he emphasized that all the Russian lawyer had come to talk to people about was this horrible humanitarian situation where the Russian government had cut off American families' ability to adopt Russian orphans. We now know, of course, that that was just a smokescreen for what was going on, which was a Russian emissary saying, hey, I'm here to give dirt on your political opponents. And so Trump seems to have created this narrative of, I'm really worried about Russian orphans. And then he was promptly embarrassed when that didn't hold up. But where I think we all are, struck by, based on Greg Miller's report over the weekend in the Washington Post, is this bizarre behavior of basically telling the translator, don't share any information about what you just witnessed, preventing the rest of the U.S. government from even knowing that the second meeting with Vladimir Putin had even happened. It was only about 10 days later that the White House basically came out and said, oh, yeah, by the way, we did this other meeting when we're just informing of it to you now. As if it wasn't meaningful. And then the final point, I'll conclude on this, was about 10 days later with the New York Times, Trump repeated this canard about adoption, pretending that was the central aspect of why this Russian emissary had been received at Trump Tower by Don Jr., Jared Kushner, and Paul Manafort. It doesn't add up.
And Michael, as Andrew just lined up there in the timeline, it is possible in what Andrew was describing that in his secret discussion with Vladimir Putin, where only the Russian translator was present at that dinner, that Donald Trump could have been getting his story straight with Vladimir Putin about what to tell the New York Times about the Trump Tower meeting before then getting the story straight with Donald Trump Jr. about what to tell the New York Times.
Interesting speculation for which we have no evidence. I think the timeline that Andrew outlined is intriguing, and I would add one more data point, something I reported almost 2 years ago now, or at the time, which was that Trump's lawyers knew about the content of those the emails that led to the Trump Tower meeting in late June of 2017. So it's about 2 or 3 weeks before the meeting with Putin and when the White House acknowledged that Trump was aware of it. So, and it seemed improbable that Trump's lawyers would have these emails laying out exactly what the Trump Tower meeting was about or what it was supposed to be about and not have informed their client. But all that said, I mean, look, you're going to have Eliot Engel up later. I come back to my point before. He's chairman of the House Foreign Affairs Committee, and he could subpoena the translators. Secretary Tillerson, then secretary, was there for parts of the meeting with Putin. He can be called to testify. There are ways to get at this without having to wait for Robert Mueller, who may or may not be able to answer the question. And just getting back to the point Ned made, Devin Nunes is no longer the chairman of the House Intelligence Committee. Adam Schiff is. And one of the more disheartening things I saw last week was a tweet from Adam Schiff saying that he wants to call Michael Cohen in closed session before the House Intelligence Committee. Really, at this point in the game, closed session behind closed doors? I mean, that just strikes me as completely off. Getting back to my main point, the American public and Congress deserve answers to these questions, and let's stop waiting for Bob Mueller, who may or may not be able to answer them.
Michael Isikoff, Ned Price, Andrew Weiss, thank you all for starting us off tonight. Really appreciate it. And when we come back, the Washington Post reports that President Trump has gone to great lengths, as we say, to hide what he and Vladimir Putin talk about in their private conversations. But Eliot Engel is now the new chairman of the House Foreign Affairs Committee, and he may have subpoena power that can find something out about all of that. He will join us next. And the Trump shutdown continues with one of the Trump administration's top officials saying it's like a vacation for federal workers. It's a federal vacation. It's a vacation where you don't get paid. And it's a federal vacation where a lot of them, like TSA agents and air traffic controllers, have to actually work. And the House of Representatives is now warning the president to stop trying to interfere with their hearing next month, in which Michael Cohen will testify about crimes he says he committed with Donald Trump. The Washington Post broke a big story this weekend about Donald Trump's communication with Vladimir Putin, saying that the president tries not to let anyone in his administration know what he actually says to Putin and what Putin says to him in private meetings. The Washington Post described the sources of the article this way: current and former U.S. officials. Donald Trump has fired a bunch of people who are in a position to tell this story to the Washington Post, including former Secretary of State Rex Tillerson, former National Security Advisor H.R. McMaster, and possibly the best position of all, former White House Chief of Staff John Kelly, who is not mentioned in the article in any way, which makes John Kelly one of the most likely sources of the article. For a report like this, you would expect the Washington Post to ask the former White House Chief of Staff for a comment and then report that the former White House Chief of Staff declined to comment. But there is no reference to John Kelly at all in the article. That is normally the way articles like this protect their sources. Rex Tillerson answered some of the Washington Post's questions by email, but when he was asked if the president seized the notes taken by the White House interpreter and ordered the interpreter not to tell anyone what was said in the meeting that Rex Tillerson was in, Rex Tillerson refused to answer those questions. Rex Tillerson was in the meeting where the Washington Post said that that happened. Rex Tillerson could have easily told the Washington Post, I did not see the president take the interpreter's notes, but Rex Tillerson didn't say that, didn't help the president in any way. He refuses to answer that question. The Washington Post reports on one of the encounters that the president had with Putin that no other U.S. officials witnessed, including a one-on-one encounter that the president had with Vladimir Putin for an hour at a G20 banquet, and the president did not allow an American interpreter to join that discussion. It was a discussion between Donald Trump and Vladimir Putin with Vladimir Putin's translator. What will we ever know about what Donald Trump said to Vladimir Putin and what Vladimir Putin said to Donald Trump? It could be that the American interpreters who have been present in those discussions are the only people who can tell us. And right now, the only people who might be able to get answers from those interpreters are Robert Mueller and our next guest, the new chairman of the House Foreign Relations Committee. Joining us now is Congressman Eliot Engel, a Democrat from New York City and chairman of the House Committee on Foreign Affairs. Mr. Chairman, thank you very much for joining us tonight. I really appreciate it. And given this reporting in the Washington Post, you have announced that one of the first investigations, or the first investigation you intend to do on your committee, is to find out what Vladimir Putin and Donald Trump have been saying to each other. How will you try to do that?
Well, let me first say that since the time in 2016 when the Russians interfered in our elections and tried very hard to get Donald Trump elected president, I was really offended, like so many other Americans. And from that time on, after Trump was president, there seems to be some kind of a symbiotic relationship between Putin and Trump, where Trump is dissing our traditional allies, the countries in NATO, which have served us well since the end of World War II. And somehow with Putin, there's a special kind of relationship. You just can't put your finger on it, but you sort of know it's there. And of course, with the revelation that the president instructed the interpreter to not leave any notes around, or took the notes, or whatever it was, it's clear that something's going on with Putin that the president doesn't seem to want anybody to know about. So we're going to look at that. You know, the House is organizing now. We don't have our full committee. People on the committee. That should happen after a few appointments to the committee, after a few days. And we're going to get cracking on this. We're going to be speaking with Chairman Schiff, and our committees are talking, and we're going to figure out the best way that the American people can find out what really went on. I think the American people have a right to know what their president is talking about. It's been many months since Helsinki, and we still don't have a clue. That's not acceptable.
The Washington Post says that the sources for its reporting include former administration officials, people who are in a position to have information that could help your inquiry. Include former White House Chief of Staff John Kelly, former Secretary of State Rex Tillerson, former National Security Advisor H.R. McMaster. Are those the kind of witnesses you would like to hear from?
Well, we haven't gotten that far yet, but yeah, I think witnesses who would be in the know, who would understand what happened, what didn't happen, who would understand why this is different than what we're used to with American presidents. So we would seek, I would imagine, down the line to speak to anyone who might have knowledge of what's really going on with Putin and Trump.
And I wanted to ask you about a late-breaking piece of news that the Republicans, your Republican colleagues in the House, the action they've taken tonight, they have removed Steve King from his committee assignments in the House of Representatives, in effect rebuked him that way, removed him from the Agriculture Committee and the Judiciary Committee. I want to get your reaction to the Republicans finally taking some action against Steve King for some of the racist comments that he's made.
Well, you know, the old adage, better late than never. I mean, I think this was a good thing to do. I mean, it's sad, but it was the right thing to do. I think that it was important that the Republicans did it as well. So we can't tolerate that kind of bigotry or that kind of talk. That's not tolerable. I don't care if you're a Democrat or a Republican. It's not tolerable. And so I think they did the right thing. And hopefully, people will learn from this that this is not the kind of way that certainly anyone should act, but certainly not an elected official.
Congressman Eliot Engel, now Chairman Eliot Engel, thank you very much for joining us tonight. Really appreciate it.
Thank you, Lawrence. My pleasure.
Coming up, the Trump shutdown continues, and one of the Trump administration's top officials is now saying it's just like a vacation for federal workers. This is the Trump administration's new face of cruelty. He is the one who said on the PBS NewsHour that 800,000 federal workers who are not being paid are better off. He actually used the phrase better off because he said they're now on vacation. His name is Kevin Hassett. And he seems to think that smiling is the best way to get you to believe him because you will never see him speak publicly without smiling. He is Donald Trump's chairman of the Council of Economic Advisors. He is one of the least distinguished economists ever to hold that position. And judging by his public comments, he is by far the cruelest person ever to hold that position.
They have the vacation, but they don't have to use their vacation days. And then they come back and then they get their back pay, then they're, in some sense, they're better off.
Are they all so oblivious? Are they all cruel? Is that a job requirement for working for Donald Trump? It's not like vacation, because when you're on vacation from your job, you still get paid for your job so you can make your car payments and your mortgage payments and your rent payments. And it's not like vacation for air traffic controllers and TSA agents and many others, Coast Guard officers, who are still going to work every day and not being paid for their life-saving work. They're not better off. No one is better off in this shutdown. Joining our discussion now, Jennifer Palmieri, former White House communications director for President Obama and a former communications director for Hillary Clinton's presidential campaign. Adam Gentelson's also with us. He's a former deputy chief of staff to Senator Harry Reid and the director of public affairs for Democracy Forward. And Jennifer, it is just astonishing to me. I mean, I've watched Kevin Hassett just make the most ridiculous statements I've ever heard an economist make from the White House about the exploding national debt under President Trump, which President Trump promised to reduce, the exploding deficit under President Trump with the tax cuts, a deficit that President Trump promised to reduce. Kevin Hassett has said a lot of horribly embarrassing things just at a professional level as an economist. But this about vacation takes him to a whole new level.
And what it betrays is that they think this is all a game, right? The shutdown to them is all a game of brinksmanship, and they get caught up in it. And it's about getting a big win for themselves and for President Trump's supporters. And you know, I think he's pretty far removed from the concerns that everyday families and federal employees have who aren't making mortgage payments this week, who aren't able to make their car payments. And, you know, if you fly a lot like I do, TSA employees who are showing up and doing a great job and being really courteous in the face of long lines and uncertainty if they will ever get paid. And it just shows, I think it really betrays how they treat all of this as if it's a game. And
Adam, I flew last night and my plane took off on time. It landed early thanks to air traffic controllers who have to worry about how they're going to make their mortgage payments, who have to worry about how they're going to make their car payments, tuition payments possibly for some kids they might have in school. These same air traffic controllers are the people I'm counting on to get my plane back on the ground safely. They're doing a remarkable job. There's nothing like vacation here for them.
No, that's right. And, you know, one of the things that we see happening here, I think, is the Republican myth of government is running smack hard into the reality of what government really is. And, you know, government is a force for good in people's lives across the board. And from the, you know, TSA workers you guys are talking about to people who process tax returns, you know, these are not jobs that are often heralded, but they're incredibly important to our daily lives, to our safety, to our prosperity. And one of the things the Trump administration is trying to do here is keep some of the sort of more high profile and essential parts of the government open. Some of them are funded by an appropriations bill, but other parts of the government they're just keeping open illegally. They're trying to keep the national parks open because they don't want to deal with the public relations disaster that comes from closing the national parks. The organization I work for, we actually think that's illegal, and we asked for an IG investigation into that. But that's what the Trump administration is trying to do, is avoid the sort of nasty parts of shutting the government down to try to convey this myth that government doesn't really matter, when in reality it's actually extremely important.
And Jennifer, Kevin Hassett makes a living in his job there in the White House by basically saying better off is like his motto for everything, that the farmers who are suffering under the Trump tariffs that are preventing them from reaching export markets they normally reach are better off. He'll make that kind of argument all the time. And he will do this with anything that the Trump administration, any horribly perverse economic policy that the Trump administration has gotten itself into. But for him to sit there and actually talk about these federal workers this way is just a new height for me. I have known some of the Republican chairs of economic advisors for presidents, honorable economists with whom you can have reasonable disagreements about policy outcomes. I've never heard anything like this from them. Before the Trump administration.
Other economists I don't necessarily agree with, but Republican heads of the Council of Economic Advisors, Republican administrations, they have a different theory about how the economy can work best than I do. But then you have someone like Kevin Hassett who comes in who is merely there to spend whatever he needs to in order to make a whatever the situation is be positive for Trump, and that this is really, I think this is particularly telling about how little they care about the impact that this has on actual Americans who are going, very few people in America are not living paycheck to paycheck anymore, and to not have any kind of certainty as to when this thing will end, and you certainly don't have any leadership from the White House about when it will end, and facing the sense that they may never get, there's no certainty they'll get this lost pay back either.
Adam Johnson, having worked in the Senate as you have, I don't know if you see this the way I do now. As far as I'm concerned, it is now the McConnell shutdown, because I've never seen a Senate majority leader who would stand for this conduct in the White House that Mitch McConnell is accepting. Any previous Senate majority leader under any previous president, even if the president was in his own party, would have taken up these House bills and gotten this government reopened over a veto if necessary.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, to be completely clear about this, Mitch McConnell could end this shutdown tomorrow. He could bring a variety of different funding bills to the floor to let them pass. But one of the bills he could bring to the floor is the bill that passed his own Senate just a few weeks ago unanimously. So, he could bring that bill to the floor tomorrow. It would pass the House immediately. He would have to face the prospect that it could get vetoed by President Trump. But since this bill passed in December by 100-0, he could override that veto and end the shutdown.
We're going to squeeze in a break here. When we come back, so far, the worst day of congressional testimony about Donald Trump was James Comey describing President Trump, trying to get him to drop his investigation of Michael Flynn. But there is a much worse day of congressional testimony coming up for Donald Trump, and that is when Michael Cohen testifies to the House next month about crimes that he says he committed with and at the direction of Donald Trump. And that's why Donald Trump is attacking Michael Cohen again, and House committee chairmen are warning the president not to interfere with their investigation. We are now 3 weeks away from Michael Cohen's public testimony before the House Oversight and Government Reform Committee. Yesterday, Democrats in that committee issued a warning to President Trump saying he cannot discourage, intimidate, or otherwise pressure a witness not to provide testimony to Congress. And they did that following what the president said about Michael Cohen on Fox News on Saturday.
In order to get a sentence reduced, he says, I have an idea. I'll give you some information on the president. Well, there is no information, but he should give information maybe on his father-in-law, because that's the one that people want to look at, because where does that money? That's the money in the family. And I guess he didn't want to talk about his father-in-law. He's trying to get his sentence reduced. So it's pretty sad. It's weak, and it's very sad to watch a thing like that. I couldn't care less.
Couldn't care less. Did it sound like he couldn't care less? The Fox News host then asked the president the most gentle possible follow-up question: what is the name of Michael Cohen's father-in-law? And the president's answer was, I don't know. But he does know just how harmful Michael Cohen's testimony is going to be for him. And as these 3 weeks tick down, to Michael Cohen's big testimony day in the House of Representatives, you can expect Donald Trump's Michael Cohen panic to only increase. We'll be back after this break with more on Michael Cohen's testimony coming up next month in the House Oversight Committee. Thanks to Stormy Daniels, Michael Cohen is going to testify to Congress next month and describe crimes he says he committed with Donald Trump to cover up Donald Trump's relationship with Stormy Daniels. And we would know none of this if Stormy Daniels hadn't gone public and then provoked a federal investigation that now refers to the president as Individual One. And we're back with Jennifer Palmieri and Adam Jentelson. Jennifer, the Michael Cohen testimony next month in the House of Representatives, with Stormy Daniels attending, by the way, she's announced she's going to be attending, will surely be the, so far, worst day of public testimony in Congress about Donald Trump.
Yeah, it has potential of being worse than Jim Comey, and we are seeing the impact of having a Democratic House. Donald Trump's days of having unchecked power are over, and when you have someone who's going to come testify about the crimes that he committed with you, and you try to intimidate him publicly, chairmen of congressional committees are going to call you out and say that you may be committing obstruction of justice. I think the fact that Steve King lost his committee assignments today, I think that is an effect of the Democratic House, because if the Republicans hadn't taken action, the Democrats in the House would have censured Steve King. So for the first time, you see the Republicans actually taking some action. Like, it shows the impact of when one body of Congress at least is willing to really stand up and do its job. And Trump is going to be held accountable in ways he hasn't done before. It'll be quite a scene next month when Cohen testifies.
Adam Jentelson, what are you expecting in the Cohen testimony, and included in that the Trump panic in the next 3 weeks leading up to it?
Yeah, I mean, look, Trump ran his business and he's running his White House as a casual criminal enterprise. He wasn't big on due diligence, and Michael Cohen has all the secrets. So I think, a lot of the road, I think Michael Cohen has the ability to put pieces together and connect some of the dots from a lot of the individual pieces of information that have come out in the last couple of years on Trump's various criminal activities. And in particular, I think some interesting things about Russia will be put in context.
Adam Jentelson, Jennifer Palmieri, thank you for joining us. Tonight's Last Word is next. Time for tonight's last word. 30,000 teachers in the country's second largest school district went on strike today in Los Angeles. Their struggle with the school board is not just about salary, but about important issues like class size that they believe impact the quality of education. Here are two of those teachers.
I'm out here fighting for students, fighting for smaller class sizes, fighting for nurses, fighting for librarians, fighting for counselors, school psychologists, just fighting because the kids deserve it. There shouldn't be a nurse on school 1 or 2 days out the week.
We entered this profession because we care about young kids, young lives. We care about them, and we want them to succeed in their future. And we're out here to fight for them, their future, my sons and my daughter.
Los Angeles public school teachers get tonight's